A tempting job. If you were offered $20 an hour for a simple job as a night watchman, would you take it? What if the rules for keeping your job were so bizarre that they put your life at risk? That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Carlos, and in the last few months my life had become an endless cycle of unanswered interviews and bills that just piled up. I was desperate for any job opportunity, so when I saw the ad, I didn't think twice. Night watchman. Easy, no experience required, $20 per hour. It was perfect. The kind of work that seemed too good to be true. Still, necessity spoke louder. I submitted my application immediately, and to my surprise, I received a response a few hours later. They wanted to interview me that very afternoon. I arrived at the indicated address, an old and imposing building in the center of the city. The windows were covered with heavy shutters, and the facade seemed to have stood the test of time without major maintenance. Even so, I ignored the warning sign. It was an opportunity, and I needed it. The interview was brief, almost informal. The manager, a tired-looking man named Mr. Blake, seemed more interested in filling the vacancy quickly than in asking detailed questions. The job is simple, he said. You just need to monitor the cameras and make the occasional round. The building is quiet, without much movement. I accepted on the spot. There was nothing stopping me. Mr. Blake handed me a contract to sign, but the document was short and to the point, without many details. When I asked him about the rules of the job, he hesitated for a moment before replying. Oh yes, there are some rules you need to follow. But these are simple things. I'll explain everything to you before your shift starts. I didn't think much about it at the time. Simple rules seemed easy to follow. And at $20 an hour, any complication seemed worth it. What I didn't know was that those simple rules would turn my first night at work into something I would never forget. My first night on the job started off quietly, but I soon realized that this was no ordinary job. As soon as I arrived, Mr. Blake was waiting for me at the entrance of the building. He seemed in a hurry, as if he had something more important to do. Carlos, nice to see you, he said, handing me a small manual. Here are the rules. Read carefully. I don't want problems in the first round. I opened the manual as he spoke, and the instructions made me arch my eyebrow. The rules were simple, but at the same time extremely bizarre. 1. Arrive before sunset. Point 2. Never leave the monitoring room between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Point 3. If someone knocks on the door, ignore it. No one should be here. Point 4. If the lights flash, pray for them to come back. I looked at Blake, expecting him to laugh and say it was a joke, but he was serious. These rules are for your safety, he added, as if that explains everything. What if I need to leave the room for some reason? I asked, trying to understand. You won't have to, he replied quickly. The room has everything you need. Water, food, toilet. Just stand there and follow the instructions. It's simple. Simple. The word echoed in my mind as I entered the building and made my way to the monitoring room. It was a small space with a camera panel showing different parts of the building. There was also a swivel chair, a table with some snacks, and a thermos of coffee. Everything seemed normal, except for the manual that was now in my hands. As I settled in, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. Bizarre rules or not, $20 an hour was too good a payment to refuse. I decided that I would follow the instructions and not worry too much. After all, how much trouble could there be in an empty building? I settled into the swivel chair, adjusted the camera panel, and brewed a strong coffee to keep me awake. The monitoring room was small but functional, with everything within reach. Despite the strange rules in the manual, I thought it would be just another dull evening. The cameras showed black and white images of different parts of the building. Empty corridors, dimly lit stairs, a deserted parking lot. Nothing out of the ordinary. I looked at the clock, 1 a.m. There were still 2 hours left for the critical time mentioned in the rule. I decided that, until then, I would make visual rounds on the monitors and try to stay calm. To my surprise, the hours passed quickly. Until 2 a.m., I had not seen anything strange. I began to relax, until I laughed alone at the rules that had previously scared me. Ignore beeps? Pray if the lights flicker? This can only be some prank, I thought. But the laughter didn't last long. At 2:05 a.m., the dashboard lights began to flash. At first, I thought it was just a technical glitch, something to be expected in an old building. But as I watched the monitor, I noticed something that made me freeze. One of the cameras, positioned in the corridor on the 3rd floor, showed a figure. It was difficult to make out details on the black and white screen, but you could clearly see that it was someone. The figure was standing in the middle of the hallway, motionless, looking directly at the camera. It was as if he knew I was watching. My heart raced. I picked up the manual, frantically searching for some instruction on what to do in situations like this. But there was nothing about figures appearing on camera. The rules only said not to leave the room between 2 and 3, and to ignore any knock on the door. I looked back at the screen, hoping the figure was gone. But she was still there, motionless, her face hidden by the shadows of the hallway. Something about his posture bothered me deeply. She didn't seem to be just standing still. He seemed to be waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to control the growing fear. Follow the rules, I thought. That's all you need to do. But at that moment, the rules seemed insufficient. Because as I watched the figure, I was sure of one thing. She knew I was afraid. When the clock struck 2:15 a.m., an unexpected sound broke the silence of the room. It was a sound that shouldn't have existed at that moment, knocking on the door. I froze, my entire body paralyzed by fear. The knocks were firm, rhythmic, as if someone or something was waiting for me to open the door. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to muster up the courage to look. But then, the words of the manual echoed in my mind. Ignore the beats. My eyes slowly turned to the door. I couldn't see anything through the frosted glass, but the knocks continued, louder and more insistent. My breathing became heavy, and a cold sweat ran down my forehead. My mind was filled with questions. Who could be knocking? And why at 2:15 in the morning? The urge to get up and open the door was almost irresistible. Maybe it was just Mr. Blake testing if I followed the rules. Maybe it was just a mistake. But something in the sound of the beats told me that this was not normal. It was as if the room itself was echoing the sound, amplifying each impact in a disturbing way. I held the arms of the chair tightly, trying to stay in place. Follow the rules, I thought. Just follow the rules. But the fear was almost unbearable. The beats now seemed more aggressive, as if whoever was on the other side had lost their patience. I covered my ears with my hands, trying to block out the sound. Minutes seemed like hours. My heart was beating so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts. Then suddenly everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I took my hands from my ears slowly, afraid of hearing anything again. I looked at the door, hoping to find some evidence of what had happened. But the door was exactly as it had been before, closed and with no signs that anything or anyone had. I looked at the clock. 2:30 a.m. There were still 30 minutes left for the critical period to end. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the fear wouldn't go away. I knew that night was far from over, and whatever was out there was still waiting for me. After what seemed like an eternity, the beating stopped, and the clock finally struck 3 a.m. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. I knew I needed to understand what was going on. There was something very wrong in that building, something that didn't make sense. I decided to review the camera recording. Maybe I could find some explanation, some clue to what was haunting me. With trembling hands, I navigated the monitoring system, looking for the exact moment when the raids began. When I located the time, a chill ran down my spine. At 2:08 a.m., the figure in the third-floor hallway was still there, still, staring directly at the camera. I watched the video, expecting to see her move or disappear. But nothing happened until the clock struck 2:15 a.m. It was at that exact moment that she disappeared. She simply disappeared from the frame, as if she had never been there. At the same time, the beats began. I rewound the video several times, trying to find some evidence of movement, but it was as if it had evaporated into thin air. There was no shadow, no sound, nothing to explain the disappearance. The feeling of discomfort grew by the second. Whatever that was, it seemed to play with the rules of logic. I looked at the camera panel, hoping that everything had returned to normal. But then I noticed something even more disturbing. One of the cameras was completely turned off. The screen that previously showed the corridor leading to the monitoring room now displayed only static. My heart raced. I picked up the manual again, frantically flipping through for some instruction on cameras turned off, but there was nothing. The rules were clear about what to do in case of knocks or flashing lights, but they didn't mention anything about what to do when a camera stopped working. I looked at the clock. There were still hours left on my shift, but the idea that the hallway leading to the monitoring room was now out of my sight was terrifying. Whatever had turned off that camera could be approaching, and I would have no way of knowing. The silence of the room now seemed more oppressive than ever. The hum of the cameras, which I had previously ignored, now felt like a constant reminder that something was wrong. And with each second that passed, I was more certain that that night's shift was far from over. At 3 a.m., when I thought things were finally stabilizing, the lights started flashing again. First it was a slight tremor, as if the power was unstable. But within seconds, the monitoring room was plunged into total darkness. The blackout was complete, absolute, as if even the night itself had decided to turn off its light. At first, I tried to stay calm. It's just a power outage, I thought, trying to convince myself. But then came that feeling. It was subtle at first, a shiver down my spine that made me freeze. It was as if the room had become smaller, more oppressive, and the air around me felt heavy. As my eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, I heard a sound. It wasn't something loud or clear. It was a slow, almost imperceptible drag from somewhere in the room. My muscles froze, and my breath was stuck in my throat. There was something there with me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I remembered the words in the manual, "Pray for the lights to come back." I'm not a religious person, but at that moment, I started to murmur a prayer, anything that could keep me focused. My thoughts were in chaos, and all I could do was wait for the lights to come back on. The sound got closer. It was as if something was moving slowly, exploring the space around. My eyes tried to find some sign of movement in the darkness, but it was useless. The low hum of the cameras had also disappeared, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat filling the silence. Then finally the lights came back. The sudden glow of the lamps made me blink, but as soon as I opened my eyes, my attention was immediately drawn to the living room window. My heart stopped. There were handprints on the glass. There were several, large and long, scattered in a disorderly way. The marks looked fresh, as if something had pressed his hands against the glass hard. What was even more disturbing was that they were inside. I touched the glass, trying to understand how that was possible, but before I could process what I was seeing, the marks began to fade. Not as something that has been cleansed, but as if it were evaporating before my eyes. I walked away from the window, my heart racing and my hands shaking. There was no longer any doubt that something was watching me, something that was closer than I would like to admit. I looked at the clock. There were still a few hours left on my shift, but I knew the worst was yet to come. When the shift finally ended and the sun began to rise, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The monitoring room, which had seemed so oppressive during the night, was now quiet, almost quiet. But what had happened there did not leave me alone. I needed answers. I decided to confront Mr. Peterson, the supervisor. He was the only person who could clarify what was happening in that building. I left the room and found him waiting in the hallway, as if he already knew I needed to talk to him. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles that looked old. He looked as tired as I was. "I need to understand what's going on here," he said bluntly. "The flashing lights, the marks on the glass, and something that appeared on the cameras. None of this is normal." Peterson sighed, running his hand over his face, as if he had been dealing with this same conversation for a long time. "Carlos," I said, to follow the rules. "Is that it? They are there for a reason." His answer irritated me. "But what reason? Who wrote these rules? And what happens if I don't follow them?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes avoiding mine. It was then that he said something that chilled me. "The previous ones, those who ignored the rules, they didn't finish their shift." My heart raced. "What do you mean by that? What happened to them?" Peterson shrugged, but it wasn't a gesture of indifference. It was as if he didn't want to, or couldn't, say more. "Carlos, the job is simple. Follow the rules. If you do, you're safe. That's all you need to know." "Sure of what?" I pressed, my voice now louder. "From whom, or what?" He looked directly at me for the first time, and there was something in his eyes that made me retreat. It was a tired look, but also full of something deeper. "Fear. You don't want to know," was all he said. He started to pull away, but I couldn't move. His words were stuck in my mind, swirling like a fading echo. The previous ones did not finish the shift. Who were they? And what happened to them? I returned home that morning, but the answers I was looking for seemed more distant than ever. All I had was a manual full of rules and the certainty that something very wrong was happening in that place. And the worst part, I knew I would have to come back for another night. Getting back to the building that night was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Each step towards the entrance felt heavier than the last. The facade of the building, which had already looked gloomy during the day, was now shrouded in a darkness that seemed alive, as if the place itself knew I was there again. Upon entering, the monitoring room was exactly as I had left it. Small, functional, but with an aura of something I couldn't describe. The silence there was almost absolute, broken only by the slight hum of the cameras. I decided that tonight I wouldn't be obsessed with the cameras. Looking at them the night before hadn't helped at all. It only increased my fear. But that didn't mean I could ignore them completely. My job was still to monitor the building, and the rules were still clear. Follow the manual and stay safe. As time passed, the mood in the room began to change. The air seemed denser, heavier. I looked at the clock. 1:45 a.m. There were still 15 minutes to go before the start of the critical time, but something was already wrong. The cameras started flashing, not chaotically but intermittently, as if the system itself was trying to show me something. With each blink, I saw disturbing glimpses. Dark, distorted faces appeared on the screens for fractions of a second before disappearing again. It was impossible to make out details, but the faces seemed closer and closer. Panic began to take over me when I noticed something even more disturbing. One of the cameras, the one that monitored the corridor that led to the monitoring room, was turned off. The screen displayed only static, but even that seemed to emit an oppressive presence. I grabbed the manual, desperately looking for some guidance on what to do in case of cameras turned off. But as before, there was nothing. The rules seemed deliberately vague, as if whoever wrote them knew that certain moments could not be explained. I looked at the door of the living room, my heart beating so loud that it seemed to fill the room. The idea that something could be in that hallway, out of camera, was terrifying. I was alone, trapped in a space that seemed to shrink by the second. The clock marked 2 hours sharp. The critical hour had begun, and all I could do was pray that the camera off wouldn't mean the worst. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning. When the clock struck 2:15 a.m., the monitoring room was filled with an even more oppressive silence before. It was the kind of silence that made every sound, no matter how small, sound like a scream. I stood motionless, my eyes fixed on the camera panel, trying to ignore the growing fear that tightened in my chest. It was then that I heard it. Whispers. They started out low, barely noticeable, but in a matter of seconds they became clearer. My name was being called repeatedly, in a low, drawling tone. Carlos. Carlos. The voice was both familiar and strange, as if someone I knew was trying to deceive me. I stood up slowly, my heart beating so fast that it seemed to echo in the room. The whispers came from outside, from the hallway, and I knew I shouldn't open the door. The rules were clear. Never leave the room between 2 and 3 a.m., but something in that voice seemed to want to break my resolve. She was almost seductive, full of a disturbing curiosity. I took a step toward the door, my mind torn between a desire to understand what was going on and a fear of what might be outside. But then, as if the building itself was testing me, the lights started flashing again. The room plunged into darkness for a few seconds before the lamps came back on, dim and flickering. When I looked out the window, my body froze. She was there. The figure I had seen on camera the night before was now before me, separated only by the glass of the window. She was tall and thin, with an outline that seemed to change, as if the darkness itself was alive around her. His eyes shone with a strange light, fixed directly on me, as if they were trying to examine me from within. I wanted to move away, but I couldn't. It was as if that look held me in place, forcing me to face the inexplicable. My hands were shaking, holding the edge of the table as if it could protect me. The glass between us seemed incredibly thin, almost non-existent, and for a moment, I thought she was going to cross it. The words of the manual echoed in my mind. Follow the rules. But how could anyone follow rules when faced with something so terrifying? The figure did not move, did not try to enter. He just stood there, watching, waiting. And I knew deep down that she was testing me. He wanted me to break the rules. He wanted me to give in. I looked at the clock. There were still 15 minutes left for the critical time to end. 15 minutes that seemed like an eternity. And all I could do was hold on tight and pray that the figure would disappear. Because if I broke the rules, I knew there would be no going back. When the clock finally struck 4 a.m., a wave of relief ran through my body. The shift was over. I was still alive. The figure had disappeared a few minutes earlier, as if the dawn had banished his presence. But even so, something inside me said I wasn't safe. I collected my things quickly, avoiding looking at the cameras or the window. Every second in that building seemed to drain him from me, as if the very atmosphere was sucking me into the void. I passed down the hallway toward the exit, my legs heavy and my heart beating at a frantic pace. All I wanted was to get out of there and never come back. The front door creaked as I opened it, as if even the building was reluctant to let me go. I took a deep breath of the cold air of dawn, feeling for the first time in hours a whiff of normality. But before I could feel completely relieved, something made me stop. I looked back at the building that now seemed to be watching me in silence. My attention was drawn to the window of the monitoring. The handprints were still there. But what gave me goosebumps to the soul was realizing that they were inside. My whole body froze. How was this possible? I was in the room the whole time. No one entered. And yet, those marks were there, a disturbing reminder that I had never really been alone. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket, desperate to call anyone, just to hear a human voice. But before he could dial, he vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. Congratulations on completing the shift. See you tomorrow. It was Mr. Peterson's. My heart raced again. I never said I would come back. In fact, I was determined never to set foot in that place again. But that message seemed more like an order than a suggestion. It was as if he knew something that I didn't understand yet. As I walked toward my car, a lingering question echoed in my mind. Was it really over? Or was it just the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous? Is it worth earning $20 an hour when you might not survive to spend?
If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more stories like this. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos, and remember, sometimes the mystery is closer than we think. See you next time.